Hello and welcome to the Embracing the Mystery podcast, hosted by yours truly, Danny Rem. This is a podcast where we have expansive conversations around living an empowered and embodied soul-led life, expanding your consciousness and belief systems, what it means to fully embrace the mystery of life that we are all living, and so much more. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave a rating or review wherever you listen. Share it on your social media platforms, like and subscribe. Thank you for being here and enjoy. Jason, welcome to the Embracing the Mystery podcast, and thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me, Danny. It's a beautiful name of a podcast, Embracing the Mystery.
Thank you. Yeah, I really feel like that's what we're all living and experiencing. So I'm really excited to have you here today. I'm so thrilled to have a conversation with you, and I would love to start just hearing a little bit about your personal path and journey. And I know you work with different plant medicines, and I would love to hear how that all began for you and how it's evolved.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on, and thank you for reaching out and making this happen. Um, it's a question I'm often asked, and I'm never sure exactly where to start because I would imagine uh, it, these kind of questions somehow encompass really all of our lives, everything from probably pre-gestation all the way down to how the stars were aligned at birth and all of our life experiences. But I think specifically to plants, I don't know. I grew up in the woods. I think ever since a young age, maybe a big part was also my father, who had a really big interest in Native American. I grew up in the U.S., so Native American cultures and stories, and I think I was very much inspired by that. I was a Boy Scout and Eagle Scout, and so a lot of that tradition was also based on kind of Native American philosophy and theory practices. I also grew up in Virginia, which has I think, a very long history of different groups and kind of that mix of the Europeans arriving there and a very deep and complex history. So I would say that's probably where it started. Was just a deep interest in nature, in Native American ideas. I think as I got older, I became very interested in spirituality. I wouldn't say shamanism as much per se, but I think as I began to really explore and read about and try out different spiritual practices, it was really fulfilling something that was longing inside of me. I think something that after a while I noticed that I was missing, or that I felt I was missing, was some sort of deeper, like direct experiential contact of something that I felt existed. And that may sound kind of like mysterious or ephemeral, but I think part of what that was actually a very shamanic practice, something that was integrating these spiritual ideas with a practice, with a ceremonial aspect, and very much with a direct experiential aspect of something that I found in all of these spiritual traditions, but that I couldn't necessarily like experience myself. And um, so probably like in my late teens, early 20s, I became very interested in plants. As medicine, I started studying herbalism and these kind of very old practices that worked with plants, like traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurveda, European herbalism, American herbalism, Native American herbalism. So I was very fascinated by plants as healing modalities. But then there was this aspect of this direct experiential quality that I felt I was still working with them in a somewhat allopathic way of very much looking to treat things from a symptomatic basis. maybe rather than a more holistic basis. And at a certain point in my life, one particular plant or an amalgamation of plants very much began calling me. And that plant was ayahuasca. And I'm sure some listeners of your podcast are familiar with that. It's certainly, I think, much more in the collective conscious these days. At the time, there was very little, if no information about it. I just started coming across it. A very good friend of mine was part of the Santo Daime Church. Um, I was very hesitant to work with it. I think because I was still of this kind of belief that everything I needed was inside of me and I didn't need necessarily anything outside of me to fulfill that. But kind of a series of events started happening that I just couldn't ignore. These kind of synchronicities or serendipities, or maybe one could say, if one is maybe more familiar with these ideas, that the plant was actually calling me. And eventually I just couldn't ignore it anymore. And so I found myself in the Peruvian Amazon, working with ayahuasca. Um, I ended up going back after that experience because it was very enlightening. It was very much what I was looking for. It was really a direct connection to what I viewed as source, or a very ancient wisdom, a very ancient technology that allowed me to experience things that I was really longing for. Um, and so I went back to live and to learn from, to work with predominantly one indigenous group in the Amazon, but that turned to being various different groups and peoples and teachers in the Amazon, and really opening me up to this world of, I think, as you said, plant medicines and kind of the history behind them, the cosmology, the medicine of them, the stories, the dances, to really have a deeper understanding. And it's been a very fluid journey. It's an ongoing journey. I'm always a student of these plants and their almost infinite uses. And yeah, somehow that just became my life, and it was never it was never really something that was planned, but it just happened to be like that. And at some point, I did a number of trainings and initiations, and I slowly started working, and that somehow turned into more or less my main profession now.
Hmm.
So I know that's kind of a maybe a long explanation, but I tried to make it somewhat short.
So beautiful. Thank you. And I'm curious if you would maybe elaborate on when you're saying the plants are calling you, because I feel that that is such a special experience. And maybe the listeners aren't necessarily familiar with that, or maybe they're kind of like feeling that's happening. But what was that experience like for you, like when you're saying the plants were calling you?
Well, I think it's maybe another big question, or my responses tend to be maybe quite big, but I think a lot of these things, they're like, I think one of the functions that I find myself being in now is kind of this bridge between more traditional or indigenous worldviews, cosmovisions that I've had the opportunity to study and live with, and also Western cosmovisions, Western worldviews, the world that I also come from. Um, it's very interesting because even that term cosmovision, it we often think of it as something more traditional or indigenous, and we don't think that we necessarily have a cosmovision, but every human being has a cosmovision. It's literally how you see the world, and our cosmovision is usually a product of all of the things I said in the beginning, the stars when we were born, our families, our DNA, our epigenetics, the family structures, and the things they say to us, our societies, our religions, all of these things literally begin to create the world as we see it. Um, and people do see the world very differently. Um, so when we speak about these things like how can a plant call us, I think for a lot of people coming from a more Western worldview, that sounds quite strange. Because one, we may not view plants as conscious or having the ability to communicate with us. But that's a very particular worldview. It's probably the predominant worldview right now, but certainly throughout history as we know it, it was the minority worldview. The majority worldview of most cultures around the world was that everything had a consciousness and everything could speak if we were able to listen to it. And so there's this idea that plants can speak to us, that animals can speak to us, that a rock can speak to us. I mean, I think you're coming from the Sacred Valley of Peru, and that's a very alive concept there. That the mountains can speak to people, and that may sound strange, but even without altering your consciousness in any way, if you hike to one of the tops of these mountains, these apus, I mean, it's almost a different world up there. It's almost a different universe. There's a stillness, there's a profundity, there's a true power. And if you stay up there for long enough, I think even many skeptical people would feel like if they really begin to open themselves to a certain sensitivity, that they feel they begin to receive information, whether that's their own consciousness or their higher self, or it's coming from the spirit of the mountain or from God or from, again, whatever our worldview is. I think it's something a lot of people have experienced. And certainly if one does work with a lot of these sacred plants like ayahuasca or tobacco or wachuma, San Pedro, peyote, iboga, um, I think one would be hard pressed to not have that worldview that these plants communicate with us. And again, depending on how we want to look at that, but something is being communicated and something is being communicated to us by someone, something. So when I say the plants were calling to me, um, there's also a difference in worldview in that often in very traditional worldviews, it was seen that not only was everything conscious, but everything was connected, that nothing was separate. Uh, and so events that happen, things that happen, messages that happen are not seen as separate. Everything is seen as connected. And so um, I think what happened to me is that plants specifically began coming up, like literally in my vision. I would someone would talk to me about it, and this wasn't a word that was in the vocabulary at the time, so it was strange that it started to happen, or I would dream about something that was related to even things that I didn't understand at the time, but I came to know after that were somehow related to ayahuasca. But I had an inkling that somehow that dream was pointing me towards that plant or the jungle. These kind of serendipitous events started happening. But essentially, what I felt was that I couldn't explain all of these things that were happening to me from a rational lens. Um, like the probability or kind of this idea of coincidence being the explanation started to feel much more feeble than this idea that something was calling me to the jungle. Even from a very rational mind, that seemed like a more probable answer that then all of these things were just coincidences that began happening to me. And so um, there's often this idea that when we're ready for something, I mean, you have like these sayings in Zen, for example, like when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And I think that can be put to anything in life. Like when you're ready for a relationship will appear. When, I don't know, you're an athlete and you're ready for the Olympics, like that opportunity will arise, but it's only going to arise when you're ready for it. Um, and so in retrospect, the plants were calling me. and it was somewhat apparent at the time, and in retrospect it was very apparent from I think all of the synchronicities that began happening, and also how it began to shape my worldview and how I began to see things. It's this idea that plants are sentient and they are conscious. Um, it's interesting because sometimes, like working, like a couple small examples, like often when we're working, people will purge in their purge bucket and will say, oh, take that out to a tree or to the land and give it as an offering. And people will look and they'll, especially if they haven't done this before, they'll look at that as if it's somehow like dirty or it's like soiling the land. Even that word, like to soil, it has a bad connotation, even though to soil something should have a beautiful connotation, that the soil is what nourishes the earth. But it's seen that vomit is like somehow bad or disgusting, but it's nourishment to the land. It's food for the land because we as humans have a symbiotic relationship to the entire plant kingdom. Um, Plants give us everything that we need, that we vitally need for our existence. They give us air, they give us food, they give us um, um, our medicines. They gave us, even maybe some people may see as like some intangible joy, and certainly from a deeper perspective, this idea of medicine is they're also giving us this deep wisdom. And then everything that we do as humans, we breathe oxygen, we emit carbon dioxide. That's food for the plants. Literally our poop, our pee, our vomit, all of these things are food for the plants. Our bodies, as we decompose, that becomes an essential part of the cycle of life. So this idea that there's always this symbiotic relationship, and so it's seen that plants have medicine, and that's not something that's super abstract from a Western point of view. I mean, still something like 70% of our pharmaceutical medicine is plant derived. If it's not directly taken from plants, it's synthesized from an alkaloid that was discovered in plants. So throughout time, plants have been known as being medicine for humans. And so I think there's also, we often look, I think interestingly, instead of the symbiotic relationship, that it's more of like a one-way relationship, that we're taking something from plants, but we're not necessarily giving back. And that's also a very deep principle of a lot of these traditions, is this idea of reciprocity. How do we give back? But one of the ways that I think we do give back from plants is to actually use them, to use them as medicine, again, in a responsible way, in a respectful way. But imagine if I was a human who had medicine and no one took it. There would be something very sad about that. There would be something very unfulfilling in my own life about that. And I think it's no different for the plants. Like, they have medicine and they have medicine for humans, and they want to share that medicine. And so ultimately, as we begin to open up, to become more sensitive, more in tune with plants, there's a natural aspect where those plants are calling to us because they want to give their medicine. They want us to use their medicine. And ultimately, they want us to embody the qualities of their medicine. Um, and that's how they can really spread in a way that they can't necessarily do in this physical reality. So that idea of calling to humans is something that may seem a bit foreign or abstract, but I think it's actually an essential part of the relationships between humans and plants.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for bringing all that in, the different cosmovisions and also this concept of reciprocity with nature, because it is so important, I feel like, within these realms of work to acknowledge that. And I love the example that you just gave of like, it would be so sad if we had medicine and we didn't share it, and that the plants want to help us and they want to support our healing and our evolution and consciousness. And I wonder if you can speak a little bit about maybe like how your own process has been with that, and coming to also like serve these plants and what that's been like for you.
Well, reciprocity is a fundamental principle in all traditions around the world, including our own Western traditions. Even if you think about this idea of dis-ease, I mean, dis-ease means to not be at ease. So it means that something is not in balance, something is not in this reciprocal wholeness. It's out of integrity. Integrity literally meaning wholeness. So whenever there's a dis-ease, there's an imbalance. And in traditional cultures, it was often seen that an imbalance, to bring something back into balance, we had to make a payment. We had to do something in a reciprocal nature. And to make a payment doesn't mean to pay with money, but it means to give. Um, it's a very Newtonian kind of Western concept too. I mean, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, and that's that idea of balance. And so, if things are taken and taken and taken, and nothing is given, then something is going to become out of balance. We're going to have a disease. It can be on an individual level, it can be on a collective level, it can be in the level of the planet. Um, and so this idea of reciprocity is to bring things back into balance, to make things integral, to make them whole, to make them healthy, um, to bring balance. In terms of my own work, this idea of reciprocity, there's certainly within traditions, you have ways of bringing reciprocity, whether it's making offerings or doing trainings or cleansing yourself or making things, singing things. There's all sorts of ways, planting trees. There's all sorts of ways of doing that. And I think all of those ways are very good and very, very essential. And I think there's something very personal in what it means to be in reciprocity, because we all are individuals. We're all unique manifestations of God, and therefore, as you said, we all have our own medicine, and how that's expressed is going to be very different for different people. Being a stockbroker is medicine. Being a janitor is medicine. Being an actor is medicine. Being a nurse is medicine. Being I don't know, a telephone receptionist, like all of these things have medicine. There's nothing that's not medicine. And so finding what that means for you is very much about making that payment or bringing things into reciprocity, sharing your medicine, giving it. Um, I think for me, with plants, um, I never, when I came down to the Amazon, for example, I never had the idea, for example, to work with or to serve medicine. It was a very personal um, journey for me. It was really out of curiosity and wanting to learn and wanting to understand better this kind of amazing thing that came into my life. As I started doing more work, and especially as I started getting initiated into tobacco, again, kind of this idea that the plants began to speak to me um, became very, very prevalent. And the man who I learned the tradition of connecting to trees via the medium of tobacco. Um, Again, I never had any desire to do that. I mean, that would have seemed crazy to me at the time, that I would be serving or working with tree medicine and tobacco. But during that apprenticeship, um, I I received very clear visions that I needed to keep this work alive. And at that time, I didn't see many people working in that way. I mean, my teacher was really the only one, and he had very few students at that time. And I think there's this quote by Mahatma Gandhi, which is, "Be the change that you want to see in the world." And I felt like this work that I was doing, this gift kind of that I was being given was very precious and very beautiful. And I didn't want it to die out. I felt like I had some obligation to keep this tradition alive. And that was really the vision. That was the insight that was coming to me. And I think often the way these insights or these visions comes is on the one hand something very direct, and on the other hand something that's somewhat ambiguous. Because I don't think, in a way, these plants want to tell us exactly what to do, because that takes away our free will, it takes away our responsibility, it takes away our reciprocity in a way. So they give us wisdom and they give us insight, and then they ask us to be able to walk that, to bring that into this world, to take all of these things from the unmanifested realm and to make them manifest. That's why even in like Christianity, it said that humans are made in God's image, is because God, from that cosmovision, is the creator, and that creative force is the creative force of life. And humans are our highest uh, calling, I guess you could say, is to be in God's image, which means to create, to bring from the spirit realm, from that which is not physical, into to descend it from the realm of spirit and to descend it into this world, into this physical world, into this world of duality. And that's the act of creation. Um, and so I think the plants, they ask us to begin to do that. I mean, that's even where these ideas like to be inspired comes from. It's literally to be filled with spirit, and then to create. And so in that initiatory process, I received, or I felt I received, that I needed to keep this tradition alive. And um, how that happened, I didn't know. Like, was I supposed to write a book about it? You know, I didn't know. But I was also working at a big ayahuasca center at that time, and like I always tried to keep my work somewhat separate and not to kind of cross things or cause any sort of disharmony. Um, but I started noticing people were coming to me and asking what I was doing, or saying like, "You seem like you've changed," or "There's something you have that in a way I want, not in a bad way, but like in a good way." Um, and so I found myself working specifically with tobacco to kind of help people, to help them clean, to help them clear, because a lot of the work we were doing was very intense, and so having these regular cleansing practices are very useful. Um, and kind of like that, I just started working, and then the first person came to me wanting what in these traditional practices is called a dieta. It's kind of like a practice where you go into isolation and you fast and you ingest a plant, usually through a master plant like tobacco or ayahuasca, to really amplify, to enhance this connection, in general under the guidance of someone who already has a connection with that plant. And I found myself doing that, and not a lot, but once here, once there, and then two people are coming, and then more, and then I reached out to also the woman who I work with, Marav, because also I saw that there was a real power between also working with these archetypal energies, um, that being of a man and a woman, and the energies that we archetypally carry, which are very different, complementary and different. And and like that, I started working, and even then, like it was never like something that I felt I was going to do, but it just happened. And so I would say like part of that is also the reciprocity. I mean, these traditionally, from my experience, kind of the apprenticeship of any of these traditions or these paths is very difficult. There's a lot of sacrifice that goes into them, a lot of time alone, a lot of cleansing, a lot of fasting, a lot of doing nothing, time away from friends, time away from families, sexual abstinence, abstinence of food, abstinence of all of kind of the nice things in life that we get pleasure. So I think part of the reciprocity is really doing those practices. And I think by doing that, not only is there something very physical about that, about the cleansing, the opening practices, that the self-reflection, the wisdom that comes to that, but there's also this energetic reciprocity, which is like I'm willing to sacrifice these things that I really enjoy or love in order to receive the wisdom of these plants so that I can embody the energy of those plants. As we begin working, there's always reciprocity. There's giving of our time, of our energies, of continuing to learn, of very practical things, of making offerings to these plants, of sharing them, of sharing their wisdom. So, again, it's a big question, but that idea of reciprocity is certainly something that's very important. And I think something that's very, very personal for each person of finding how do each of us come into a reciprocal relationship ultimately with life and who we are.
Mm. Thank you, Jason. And would you be willing to speak a little bit about what the benefits are of working with tobacco and also like with these other plants and trees that you're speaking of as well? Because I know that in the West, especially, it's been misused or people maybe perceive it as like cigarettes. I know that you're speaking of like Amazonian mopacho, like pure tobacco. But yeah, maybe like the benefits and what that can do for you and what it's done for you as well.
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, I could probably talk for a long time about it, but I think sometimes we also, as you said, I mean, I remember reading a study that was quite sad, but it was in the US and they asked kids where an apple came from and um, like where it originated from. And the most commonly given answer was a supermarket. It wasn't that it originated from a tree. And I would imagine, I would conjecture, I haven't done this, but if you did the same thing with tobacco, people would say like it comes from a cigarette or it comes inside of a cigarette box. Like that there's not even necessarily that direct correlation that it's a plant and that it's an amazing plant. It's a beautiful plant, like all plants are. I think the reason tobacco also has such a bad kind of rap um, is because it was so widely embraced, because it was so widely taken on um, by the people who immigrated to the Americas, by the Europeans, the Africans, whatever group came over, very much embraced tobacco because they saw it as this really amazing plant. Um, and they learned directly from the indigenous people of the Americas that for most of them it was considered one of the most, and I would say actually for most of the indigenous people of the Americas it was considered the most sacred plant that they worked with, and 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 the effects were probably very immediate too. I mean, I remember the first time I smoked a big pipe. Like I was super in Spanish they use this word mareado. It means like seasickness or dizziness. I mean, I became super dizzy. The world started spinning and I got super hot. My heart was racing, super nauseous, and I like literally was able to crawl to my bed and I just kind of for a couple hours allowed the waves to pass. So the effects are very immediate. Um, Also, when I dieted tobacco the first time, it was up until that point, and I had done a number of other dietas, it was the strongest I'd ever done. And the effects were very immediate and very tangible. Um, and so I think that's why tobacco was so widely, one, used by the indigenous people of the Americas, because almost ubiquitously they viewed tobacco, much like I was saying, as the plant of the creator. It was the plant that God gave to humans. Often there's this story that God gave tobacco to humans so that humans could dream like God dreamt the universe into creation. So it's already showing you some of the qualities of tobacco, that it is this primordial plant, that all plants like it, that all plants, it's kind of like this idea that it's food, it's spiritual food, it's physical food of plants. and that it allows us to dream, it allows us to manifest, to create, much like God created. So I think that's why it was so widely embraced. You can see similar ways that something like coca was used. When coca, also you're coming from the Sacred Valley, it's an extremely sacred plant to many people there. The way they use it, they use it in a very integral way. And I think often where, like you could say that the corruption of these plants comes from is we become disconnected from them. We become disconnected from not only their use, but the stories, the dances, and that may sound strange, but all of these plants had an origin story. They had a specific dance, that they had specific ways that you would learn from them directly from your elder, from your wisdom keeper, from your direct experience of ingesting these plants in different ways, and that they taught you. But if those rites and rituals and practices are forgotten, then we lose the power and we can become corrupted by those plants. And that's not a crazy idea. Like most, like in the US, some countries are different. Like you can buy a lot of pharmaceutical medication over the counter, but in most countries you can't, because it's seen that there is like a gatekeeper, there's a wisdom keeper that understands the power of the medicines, that they understand there's a lot of counterindications, that you have to take them in very specific doses, that you have to know how to create them. Like most people aren't going to create their own pharmaceutical. Like it takes an alchemist, a chemist, someone to understand that process. And then how do you make it? How do you dose it? How do you give it? At what frequency do you take it? When should you take it? What should you not take it with? And so we also have these rites and rituals with our medicines, and that you wouldn't just kind of willy-nilly take a bunch of pharmaceuticals. And if you do that, many people die. I mean, pharmaceutical counterindications, hospital deaths, I think are the third leading cause of death now in the US. So it's millions of people every year. That's not to say pharmaceuticals don't have a place, but it is to say that there's very deleterious consequences of them too, if not worked with correctly. So it's not necessarily different from these plants. Having said that, these plants are, I would say, far more forgiving than pharmaceuticals, because there is a wholeness to them, and there's an intelligence, and there's also an intelligence in the body. So there tends to be natural purging processes, or ways that they can be transmuted or released from the body if the dose is too much. Having said that, I would certainly not recommend anyone to work with these sacred plants without guidance, because they also can be dangerous. Um, so sorry, there's a bit of a tangent, but going back to tobacco, it's really just to say that the reason it's so much in the world is because it has been embraced so much, so much more than really any American plant, or any plant in the world for that matter. I mean, it's used worldwide for some sort of intoxicating effect. Um, I mean, maybe the only one that would come close is something like coffee or tea. Um, so, but again, the ways of working with it have been lost. As you said, when most people think about tobacco, they think about cigarettes. Um, Even the story of cigarettes, it's how you process tobacco to be able to smoke it. But there's a lot of issues with cigarettes, from how you process it. Most tobacco is fire or flue cured, meaning it's a much quicker process because it's better for kind of the commercialization of it. But when you process it that way, you change the structure, and you have to ingest it into the lungs to receive the same benefits. Uh, like many plants, they use a lot of fertilizers, a lot of chemical pesticides, herbicides, which I think we're beginning to find out. I mean, we've actually known this for a long time, but it's coming more, I think, to a collective conscious that these things are not good to ingest in the human body. And then on top of that, there's a lot of added chemicals into tobacco, and many of them are known to be very deleterious to human health. So, um, the concoction of all of those things, usually when people are referring to cigarettes, there's a whole host of very harmful things that they're ingesting into their body, which have nothing to do with tobacco. Tobacco is also an interesting plant in that many plants you would only take one way, like usually in the form of a tea or a tincture, but essentially you're working with it by ingesting it. Tobacco is an interesting plant in that there's a lot of ways you can ingest it. You can ingest it in its liquid form, you can smoke it, you can make it into a powder and inhale it, you can make it into a paste and chew it. So there's a lot of ways of applying it, and all of those ways had their purpose, their medicine. But traditionally, tobacco, as I said, was one of, if not the most sacred plant for the people who worked with it. It was on the same pedestal as these other plants that I think more and more we realize are sacred, things like ayahuasca or wachuma, coca, although probably a lot of people still don't view necessarily coca as outside of maybe the Andes as something sacred. But there's I think, a growing idea of this. And um, I think what makes these plants, like the reason I use that word sacred is because they were viewed as sacred. They were viewed in these indigenous myths as these direct gifts from God, and that they had a special place apart from the rest of the plant kingdom. Many of these stories would actually say that these plants originated from the stars. Um, Potentially not in their physical form, but in their spiritual form. That these were higher beings of consciousness, and this may sound kind of strange, but that descended from the stars as gifts, as tools of not only medicine, but really of wisdom to help to teach humans why they were suffering, and really how to help them to remember, how to help them remember on a much deeper level who they are. And so these plants like tobacco are considered these master plants or teacher plants. Also, one of the interesting things with tobacco, as I was saying earlier, in a lot of these origin myths, it was considered the first plant. So it's often said that the spirits of all of the other plants like or feed off of the spirit of tobacco, which is why often in ayahuasca ceremonies, like almost traditionally, if you were working with ayahuasca, you were also working with tobacco. When you learn from a plant, traditionally it was through the means of tobacco, because it was seen that tobacco opened you. It opened you to that dream of the creator, that dream of kind of the origins of our consciousness, that liminal, that hypnagogic state where we are between worlds, where we have the ability to be very much of this world. We have the ability to go into the underworld. We have the ability to go into the realm of spirit. And so we have this ability, in a shamanic sense, they would say, to have a foot in both worlds. This lived world and the shamanic space. And tobacco allows us to navigate that space. It allows us to go in to receive information of the plants that we're working with, we're learning from, and then to take that knowledge and then to really embody it and to walk it and to bring it into this world. Uh, Much like our dreams, many people, they receive tremendous insight from their dreams every night, but we don't have practices of cultivating that or reflecting upon it, or we view it as just these kind of random things that are happening to us. And usually when we wake up, maybe for a few seconds or a few minutes, we remember our dreams, but then they're gone because we're now fully back into this realm. And in traditional societies, they would view the dream space, the shamanic space, kind of this altered state, this state of mareación, the state of dizziness, as the same space. And so again, in this way, tobacco allows us to really receive that information. And it has a very particular effect on the consciousness where it allows us to be very present in those realms and to not allow them to be ephemeral in the same way that maybe our dream space would normally be. So we're very aware and we're able to really receive that and to go deeper into these realms of consciousness that allow us to receive this wisdom and then to bring it back. And really it's this amplifier that allows us to connect to the entire plant kingdom. So usually when we're working, for example, like we do work with tobacco, um, but most of the time we're working with very specific plants, very specific trees. But we work with those plants or those trees via the medium of tobacco because it really opens people and allows people to connect in the ways that I just said.
Yeah, oftentimes I've heard tobacco referred to as like the cell phone of the jungle, or like the cell phone to the other plants for calling the other plants, or like opening our connection to receive their teachings more deeply. Also, I wanted to mention, and maybe you can elaborate on this a little bit too. Something interesting that I learned about tobacco when I first began working with it is that it can help us heal addictions, which is really interesting to me because I know that a lot of people think that it's something that's like very addictive. And I wonder if you want to speak on that at all.
Sure. Well, again, addiction's a big topic, but I think to a lot of, and this is more and more well known, and even I think in more mainstream academia right now, but the way that I think a lot in the West we've looked at addiction often could be kind of summed up by this very early experiment that was actually done on
Mm.
cocaine. Um, and it was called like the rat park experiment, but essentially they took a rat or a mouse and they put it in a cage with nothing in the cage, and they gave it two bottles, one of liquid food and one of like liquid cocaine. And what they found is like once it tried the cocaine water, it started to go back to it, and eventually it started going back to it to the point where it gave up food and it died. And so it was kind of shown or proven that cocaine is addictive, like literally to the detriment to the life of this animal. It took, at least on the mainstream, maybe 30 years or something later before someone came along, and I forget who it was, but someone who looked at the kind of the parameters of that study and said, there's a few things that I think we didn't really control for. One is that that's a very artificial environment for that mouse or rat. Like it's not surrounded by, like it's not mimicking how it would be in nature. Um, it doesn't have its friends around him or her. It doesn't have its family. It doesn't have anything to do. It's surrounded by these artificial lights and these giants looking in the cage. And so they recreated that experiment, but they tried to mimic much more how it would be in its natural environment. It had friends, it had family, it could mate, it had things it could do, tunnels it could run around, like real food that it could eat. And what they found, and it was replicated, is it tried the cocaine water because it was curious about it, and then that was it. It never went back to it because why would it? It wasn't fulfilling anything that it didn't already have. And that really disproved this idea that a substance is addictive in and of itself. And yet that's still like a cosmovision that most of us believe to be true, that like substances are addictive in and of themselves. Even though if you just think about in your own life, like if you just reflect a few minutes upon that, you would see that that's not true. I mean, I lived in New York for a long time. For better for worse, I knew a lot of people who use cocaine. I bartended for a long time, and some people could put it down, and some people couldn't. Some people can have a cigarette and they don't like it at all. Some people become quote unquote addicted to it. Some people like alcohol, they can drink it once in a while. Some people are addicted to it. So that also shows that the thing in and of itself is not addictive. It's not like if you take this thing, an addiction forms. I think a much better way of looking at it is what I was referring to earlier, that there's always these ideas of wholeness, of balance, and uh, in our lives, we're constantly becoming out of balance. It's again a very Christian idea. It's called to sin, and that idea I think has been very like literally mistranslated. What does that mean to sin? It's seen as something very bad, but that's not what the translation means. It literally means to miss the mark. We're sinning all the time because it referred to like archers, and you're trying to hit the bullseye, and you never hit the bullseye. Like even if you think you hit the bullseye, you never, however much you want to zoom in, you're never going to hit the exact center because ultimately there is no exact center. You're always going to be some fraction of a millionth of a millimeter off of the center at best, but usually we're slightly missing it. And so the idea, it's also the same principle as yoga. It means to yoke, to steer the bull who's plowing the field, because he's never going to go perfectly straight. He's always going to go a little to the left, so you have to bring him back to the right. He's going to go a little to the right, so you have to bring him back to the left. This is the idea of sin. It means to miss the mark. And so we're always out of balance. So we're always hopefully trying to find balance. We're trying to find harmony. We're trying to bring ourselves back into balance. So that imbalance is what it means to be human. And so we're always looking for things to restore that balance. These plants are very powerful, but if we only look at them in terms of a physicality, of something that's helping us on a physical level, then we're always going to be out of balance in the relationship of that plant because the plant is only restoring us in a physical level. But when we stop using the physical substance, then there's still an imbalance. And so that's also this idea of these plants as being teachers, is because they're also trying to teach us. It's super important to bring balance on the physical level. Like if I have an upset stomach, I can drink ginger tea and that will restore a balance. But if I go back to the same behavior that created the upset stomach in the first place, then I have to keep taking ginger. And you could say then I have an addictive relationship to ginger, even though ginger is also not addictive, but my relationship to it has become that. So that idea of addiction, again, I think it's something that we don't necessarily understand so well, and that the nature of these plants is not addictive, but they can be used in a way that's seemingly fulfilling something, trying to bring something into balance, but then we end up relying on that plant to bring balance rather than necessarily getting at the root of why that imbalance was there in the first place. And that's also why I think when working with these like sacred plants in a way that honors the tradition, the wisdom, the many, many people and paths that have come before, they were designed to do it in a way to where these plants they do work on us in a physical level, but they're also working on us in a mental, emotional level, a psychological level, and they're also very much working in a spiritual level in order to teach us, so that again, as I was saying earlier, like we have the volition, we have the free will to take the steps to constantly like strive for that balance and not to rely on something outside of ourselves uh, as a crutch. Like all of these plants, they're tools and they're not meant to be worked with all the time. That's also something that's very important. Even talking about like the smoking of tobacco, like the smoking of tobacco isn't necessarily meant to be something that you do all the time for pleasure. Like it's a very specific tool to be used at a very specific time to receive very specific insights or to work in a certain way to clean, to clear. Um, and I think that's always the reason to work with these tools is because we have a deeper understanding of why we're working with it rather than necessarily trying to fulfill something that then we have to keep going back into a relationship with those substances with. Also that's where like a lot of these plants were worked with in very initiatory ways. And I think very few people, if you've worked with ayahuasca, for example, in a very strong lineage or a very strong way, there's no addiction to ayahuasca. Maybe if you're working with it in kind of a more woo-woo or new shamanic way, like going to ceremony is super fun and you connect with community and it's like a nice thing to do. If you're working with the Shipibo, you're going into darkness, and there's going to be a lot of very difficult things that come up. If you're working with tobacco, you're going to go through some strong processes, and like it takes a lot of courage to work up going to these substances because they're going to invoke a lot. Um, and so, like, even that idea of thinking of these things in terms of an addictive thing, I think again comes from we've lost the ways and we've lost the traditions. Like when you work with these things in a very strong way, there's certainly nothing addictive about them. Quite the opposite. And that was kind of the second part of your question, which goes back to the teaching of these plants. Like, the root of addiction is the mind. That the mind is the ultimate birthplace. Its nature is addictive. Its nature is looping. Its nature um, is kind of this like this infinity symbol or the yin and the yang. It's this constant mechanism. It's this like internal machine that just keeps going and going and going. And it's a beautiful tool. I mean, the mind can literally know or try and know all things. And there's a very beautiful Zen koan, which is the knife can it's also a tool, the knife, and the knife can be used to cut all things. Like you can at least try and cut all things with a knife, but a knife can never cut itself. And the mind is the same. You can use the mind to try and know all things, but the mind can never know itself. That's the nature of the mind. You can't use the mind to find solutions of the problems of the mind. And that's where these plants are very strong because they bypass the mind. The nature of these plants is not the mind, it's the heart. It connects the mind and the heart. But very much the states that these plants are taking us into is beyond the mind because it's often seen that the mind is where many, many of our problems come from. And certainly it's where addictions come from. It's where patterns come from. A lot of these addictions, they're very deeply rooted inside us too. They certainly have a physical component. They certainly have a spiritual component. But the addictive quality is this looping effect. And it's very much that's why it's so difficult to break those patterns because they're so ingrained in us. I mean, this is even this idea of like of neuroscience and what even on a very maybe more Western way of looking at the medicine of tobacco is it's working on these ideas of neurogenesis, neuroplasticity. It's literally creating new ways to where we're not going through the same addictive neural pathway. It's either being made more plastic or there's a plasticity to it, meaning it's more fluid, it's more open, it has an ability to move in different ways, or there's literally something new that's being created, a new pathway that allows us to not fall into those same addictive patterns. And all of these plants do that, whether it's tobacco or ayahuasca or iboga. Um, it's very much the medicine of these plants. Even some plants, like for example, iboga, while these experiences are very unique, and we can never kind of speak of them in archetypal ways. Interestingly, with iboga, one of the archetypal ways that many people will describe it is it takes them into the nature of their mind, often in the ceremony of death. Because traditionally it's kind of a long story, but there was often kind of a death ceremony and then a rebirth ceremony. But often in that death ceremony, it's many people describe this idea that they go into the nature of their mind and they see all of these stories, all of these addictive patterns, all of these things that they tell themselves that literally create a prison, that creates a cage that they can't break out of because it's literally these addictive mind loops. And so again, these plants are really going in, and part of their work is to not only break those, but to show us a way out, to give us wisdom, to give us insight, to show us, first and primarily that there is a way out. And when someone is under the nature of addiction, they often have no hope. They have no faith. They have no worldview that even allows them the possibility that there's a way to break that addiction. So one, it shows them that there is a way. And then two, it usually begins to show them the steps of how to break that. Literally on the physical level, it's beginning to break those addictions. On the psychological level, the mental, the emotional level, it's showing them the emotions that come up under the power of those addictions, which is usually very negative emotions, fears and angers and shame and worry. And we really have to sit with that and see that these things are not serving me. And so then that volition begins to arise that I need to break these addictions because they're not serving me. They're not serving my family. They're not serving my community. They're not serving that creative, vital impulse in me that wants to create, that wants to flourish, that wants to be a manifester, a creator who can bring, life-giving energy into this world, who can bring beauty, who can bring peace. And so then the final stage is opening us to a new way of being, to show us like what are the steps that I need to break these addictions. So these plants are very powerful tools, and interestingly, as you said, they're in general, they're not things that cause addiction, but when worked with in a proper way, they're actually things that begin to give us insight and to free us of addiction.
Wow, I feel like there's so much wisdom in the answer that you just gave. Thank you so much. It really also validates my experience that I first had when I first dieted tobacco, because I was curious about the addictive piece because I had heard, tobacco is addictive. And I remember laying in my cabin one evening and the tobacco sharing with me, um, people don't get addicted to me because I'm addictive, but I illuminate like the addictions that they have in their minds. And I really feel that. So thank you for speaking to that and elaborating more. That's super powerful.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. It's a much more condensed way than I said.
That was great though, with the story of like the rats or the mice that you were speaking of too, because I think addiction is something that is not understood in the way that you just shared it in our world, and it's not because of that treated properly.
And we all have addiction. I think that's super important to realize. I think there's also a shift that's happening in how we view the mind, how we view medicine. I mean, even when I was growing up, it was like during the Reagan years, and there was these like commercials of someone cracking an egg on a pan, like a frying pan, and saying, "This is your brain," and then they break the egg, and this is your brain on drugs, and it's like sizzling and frying. And it's interesting because like most drugstores now are called pharmacies, but they used to be called drugstores. But we have this very strange relationship of what we view as drugs. It's something very specific, and also like in the US, I mean, I think it's like 70% of adults are on like at least 4 to 5 pharmaceutical drugs. They're taking them, they're on them. So they're in a relationship where they're a drug consumer for the rest of their life. And yet we somehow view that as like okay drug use, but then there's other drug use that we view as not okay drug use. But I think very few people have actually really sat with that. And in the same way, like we look at people in a mental hospital and say they're crazy, and there can be a truth to that. Or we look at someone who has an addiction to something and we say, well, that person is very weak, because we usually tend to look at addictions or name very particular addictions. And usually what we're referring to is like a drug addiction. Uh, it could be like a what we would call a very heavy drug like heroin or cocaine. But most people, also have addictions to things like coffee or tea or cigarettes. And everyone has addiction because addiction is the nature of the mind, whether it's an addiction to their phone, which is probably the vast, vast majority of people right now. I mean, um, one of the things of the dietas is isolation, and you have nothing. And most people really, especially more and more, like when you take their phone away from them for even a few minutes, like they don't know what to do. Like there's a huge addiction to our phones, addiction to computers, to pornography, to food. It's something that also the Dieta really shows. I mean, even before I started dieting, I had a what I would describe as a very clean diet. I mean, I was quite strict, and I was also studying plants and food as nutrition and medicine, but I still had sugar, usually in the form of honey or I don't know, maybe some chocolate or something at night. And the first time I did a dieta and I didn't have access to that, I mean, I was literally like pacing around my tambo, my little hut, like a madman because like I needed sugar. I needed something to go days and weeks without it. Like I could literally, whatever it was, the parasites in me, the intelligence in me, like literally needed to be fed. And I was like in a manic state because like I couldn't feed it. I literally couldn't feed it. So addiction is the nature of the mind. Every single human being who's alive has addictions. They may realize it or they may not, but every single human being does. Unless, maybe you're Jesus or the Buddha, but for everyone else, we have addictions. And I think it's really important to realize that because I think sometimes we maybe demonize certain addictions, but we don't realize that every single human being has addictions, relationship addictions, patterns, body weight addictions is a huge one. And, being too thin or too fat. There's all these things. I don't like my looks. My skin is too light. It's too dark. My hair is too much. It's too thick. It's too thin. This is all the nature of addiction. It's not being uh, happy, content with what is, with coming into these states of wholeness. And so again, it's I think we tend to demonize certain things like maybe tobacco or these other plants, but every human being has addictions, and if we have kind of the wisdom or the courage to look at that, we can see that in ourselves, and then I think that brings a lot more compassion also when we begin to speak about the nature of addiction.
I wanted to also invite you to speak about the trees a little bit if you wanted to.
Yeah, so when I was studying in the Amazon, I found it quite interesting because most of the traditions I was working with, but like the plants that you would diet in general were trees. There's also plants as well that you can diet, very powerful plants, kind of smaller plants, herbs, smaller bushes. But very often you dieted trees, and trees were seen as, I think, something, one, very symbolic, and that much like I was speaking about, they symbolize these three realms. They root very deeply into the earth. They have their trunk in this lived realm, and then their branches are moving towards the sky or the heavenly, the spirit realm. And so they're seeing they're a physical symbol as something that connects us to these three realms. Also, this idea of past, present, future, of our body, our mind, our spirit. Um, and so they're seen as these very great teachers. Um, the Buddha received his enlightenment under a very specific tree. In Judaism, you have like the tree of life. In Egyptian mythology, you have the tree of life. The tree is it's a very sacred symbol. And I think often we look at it only as a symbol. But again, as I was talking about, even these things like pharmaceuticals, where the vast majority of them are derived from some alkaloid that's found in a plant. I mean, one of the first pharmaceuticals was aspirin, and aspirin is derived from salicin, which is like a salicylic acid, which was originally found in the willow tree, and it was being used by indigenous peoples for pain relief, to ease the load on the heart, and that's how it was kind of quote unquote discovered, and then it was, put into the alkaloid was extracted, and then I think eventually synthesized and put into aspirin. Aspirin is still somewhat natural in that sense that it's usually directly derived from a plant substance, but that's found in a tree. And so trees have a tremendous amount of medicine. I mean, most people, like traditionally in Europe, for example, like if you ever were getting sick, you would take elder syrup or elderflower tonic, and that's coming from the elder tree. And also in these traditions, so you had a physical medicine of all of these trees, usually very strong. I think a lot of that knowledge has been lost, but there's still traces of it where people understand that the very strong medicinal value of trees. Um, a lot of like cleansing of the intestines, purifying the blood, working against inflammation, um, antiviral, antibacterial, usually anti almost everything. So they have very strong medicine in the physical realm. And they're also seen as teachers. And so when connecting to what you could say is like the essence or the spirits of these trees, again, like the way we work through the medium of tobacco, and again, going through this very traditional process of fasting, of isolation, of a direct connection with this tree, is it's seen that each of these trees is a teacher, that it has a spirit and a very unique spirit. And again, these aren't super foreign concepts. Like we were chatting a bit before we started the podcast, and soon we'll be going to Ireland. And that was one of the places where we were very inspired, because in Ireland you have this very old Celtic tradition where even some people would say their language, the own language, every letter of that language corresponded to the name of a tree. Um, so, for example, like oak was dŵr or daird, and where the English word door comes from, which the door was usually like the entrance to your house, like even that word, the entrance, to be entranced. So the oak was the gateway into the house, which represents the not only your physical house, but your spiritual house. And so it was a gateway into the spiritual realm. So there's a lot of that tradition still there. You go to like Scandinavia and they still speak about, like, for example, the elder tree. They speak about this example of the Hildemord, like the the elder mother. It's often physically like drawn or shown as like as an old grandmother, and it's there's these tales that she has a lot of magic, she has a lot of power, she has a lot of medicine. And she does have a lot of medicine. She has a tremendous amount of medicine. There was like I think a 16th or 17th century English physician. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but he wrote a book on the elder, and he said something like, if people knew only a fraction of the medicine of elder, there'd be none left, because basically it can cure everything if you know how to work with it. Also, like tobacco, I was saying elder's a very interesting plant in that you can use all of the different parts, and all the different parts have very different medicine, also depending on how you prepare them. So it's really like a true medicine bag in one tree. But then also this idea that they're a teacher, like this idea that I was saying of the grandmother spirit of the elder. And so in these ancient traditions all over the world, they viewed each of these trees as a teacher. And much like if you went to a university, you'd have your science teacher, your chemistry teacher, your mathematics teacher, your history teacher, your social studies teacher. Um, and maybe even in a better way, it would be like going to a hospital and having all of these doctors who specialize in something. So you have maybe a heart surgeon or a bone doctor or a mind doctor. And so each of these trees has a very specific medicine. It's a very specific doctor. And in a lot of these traditions, and this is where it may sound kind of strange to some of your audience, but even, for example, a lot of people when when they're working with ayahuasca. Like, for example, if you sit usually in a more traditional Amazonian ayahuasca ceremony, people often think that like they're working with ayahuasca and it's the ayahuasca that's doing the healing. But usually a more traditional way of viewing that is they would view ayahuasca much like they would view tobacco, is that the ayahuasca is amplifying, it's opening, it's allowing these people who are working, these physical doctors, these curanderos or healers, it opens their vision, it allows them to see, it connects them to all of the trees or all of the plants that they've dieted. And that as each of these trees is a very specific doctor, they're calling upon the energies or the medicines of these trees in that space through the medium of ayahuasca to come and to heal the person that they're working on. And so all of these trees become like your arsenal, your tool chest, your allies, your doctors, your friends that are coming and helping you very much in that shamanic space or in that dream space. Um, One is they're physically working on you. They're giving you their physical medicine. They're also teaching you about their medicine so that you have the ability to administer their medicine. But they're also really trying to teach you to embody their medicine, and not just in a way of physically giving it, but much like in this way that each of these plants has its archetype, whether it's maybe a warrior or a peacemaker, um, or someone who can sing harmony, or someone who has very strong boundaries, or someone who's able to let the past go and to move forward in a new direction, or someone who can heal the heart or can speak from the heart, or someone who can purify and lighten the blood. Like each of these trees has its medicine. And so as you begin to embody that medicine, those teachings, then also in a way you become like a living example of the medicine of that tree, so that not only can you administer it, but your words, your thoughts, your actions are also guided by the wisdom of these trees.
I feel so excited internally just to listen, and it's really cool also because I listen so much to your podcast that you have, and it's cool to
Mm.
sit and have a conversation in real time. So thank you so much. I have I have one last question for you. I heard in one of your podcasts you spoke, or maybe it was Marav, that I think it was the two of you were speaking on how the trees, like you said, are allies and protectors. And you mentioned that sometimes they can come in like group. Do you know what I'm referring to? Is that true? And can you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, so kind of like what I was saying in a lot of Scandinavian traditions, for example, the elder is the spirit of it is represented by a grandmother, so it could be seen that it has that energy. Um, in all of these Amazonian traditions, it's very similar. It's seen that the spirit of this tree is something very very unique, um, like much like if you and some other people are looking at me right now, like Jason is quite unique, or I'm looking at you and other people are looking at you, and Danny is quite unique. Like she has her own looks, her own medicine, her own way of being, her own personality. Like she's unique, she's special. She has something that no one else has. And so it's the same with these trees. Um, how that comes to someone again is usually very personal. And there does tend to be archetypal ways that these trees will come to someone because again they have a very specific medicine. So many, I would say most trees tend to come to people as like one thing. It's very often anthropomorphized, probably because we are humans. So um, if anyone has ever read, for example, the Bhagavad Gita, a very ancient Indian Gitas or songs. They're these stories that have been passed down for probably countless generations. But in the Bhagavad Gita, God who's manifesting as Krishna, one of his incarnations, one of his manifestations, is speaking to Arjuna. And it's a beautiful story about going to war and what that means and the responsibility. And um, but Krishna is speaking to Arjuna in a human form, the form that most people would attribute to him when they're speaking about him. But at one point, Arjuna becomes so comfortable with the human form that he says, Krishna, can you show me your true form? And Krishna warns him and he says, are you sure? And he says, yeah, of course. Like, you're so nice. Or I'm making this up now, but he's so comfortable with him. He says, yeah, show me your true form. And so Krishna obliges and he changes into his true form, which the direct translation, I believe, is his 10,000 fold face. And 10,000 is a very esoteric archetypal number for infinity, for the all. Um, Also, as a side note, very interesting because I think also like this is where understanding things from different perspectives is very fascinating. And there's this really interesting, I think he's a British guy. I think his name is Daniel Tammet. He wrote an amazing book called Born on a Blue Day. He has Asperger's syndrome, and but he's highly functional. Amazing story of someone who, like usually someone with that isn't able to communicate like with the majority of humans because they're just operating from a very different place. But he trained himself to be sociable, to communicate in ways and language that we can understand. Um, but I remember reading his book and it was very fascinating because he has something called synesthesia where he can do these amazing mathematical computations where like for most of us, if we're thinking in numbers, like if we're multiplying 5 by, I don't know, 60, we kind of multiply the number 5, we see it, and we multiply it by 6, and that's, 30, and then we add the two zeros, so 300, like something like that. But for him, every number has a particular emotion, a shape, a color. So he's not seeing the numbers as like how they're written. It has um, a very particular emotional resonance, a visual resonance. And so he sees these landscapes of colors and emotions, and he's able to do these like incredibly difficult computations. But I found it very interesting because this is where I think kind of the ancient and the modern are very fascinating. But for him, every number between 1 and 10,000 is completely unique and has its own color, shape, form, emotion. But then after that, the cycle continues. So there's something very special about this number 10,000. That was a side note. But going back, so Krishna shows Arjuna his 10,000 folded face. And it's so terrifying, it's so overwhelming that Arjuna prostrates himself before and begs him and pleads with him to please come back to your form, to your human form, because his true form is so overwhelming. Um, I think that's often where, also, like in a Christian sense, this idea of the fear of God comes from, because to truly see God in its infinity is so beyond what we can perceive that's where that word awesome comes from in the true sense. It fills us with so much awe and fear. Really, it's the same side of the coin. It's the same emotion. It's something that we literally can't wrap our heads around. So the reason I say that story is because I think we as humans, we like to, and to some degree we may need to anthropomorphize something, meaning we need to see the spirit of something in a human form, so that we can relate to it, so that we can learn from it in a way that's comfortable for us. Um, but for other people, it may not come in a human form. It could come as an animal or something else, or a representation of God, or um, but to answer your question, that idea of groups, I think what we were talking about is again, usually these spirits of trees are represented by like one form, one spirit, very often one anthropomorphized symbol. It could be a grandmother or a blonde-haired woman or a black woman or a black man or a Asian man. Some is universal, some is very personal to us, to our worldview, our cosmovision. And sometimes these trees have many. There's trees that are seen as like having a group of of doctors. Ayahuma is very commonly represented as a whole army of people, or the Sinchiruna. It's one of the mythological kind of folklores behind the tree that they become your ally. Or there's trees like Waira Caspi, which is seen as like having a doctor, or sorry, having like a hospital full of doctors. So often the spirit or the vision of that tree can come to you in that way. And it's really representing the medicine that that tree is bringing. So again, it's very personal. But one of the things that I find very fascinating, and this is where I think the more Western rational mind begins to short circuit a little bit, is almost universally across cultures, when you give people one of these trees, they'll have an experience that's um, very, very archetypally the same. And that's something that's very fascinating.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Wow. And I love seeing the tree behind you as well and with the birds. It's really perfect. Yeah. Well, I feel like this is a good place to stop. And thank you so much, Jason, for your time and your energy and being here today and all of the wisdom that you brought. Like, wow, so much. And I'm just so excited to listen to it again and to share. And if there's anything that you have coming up that you would like to promote, of course I'll put your links and everything in the section below. But if there's anything you want to speak to, I'll probably release this episode in June or July. So anything upcoming.
Yeah, if anyone is interested in working with myself or me and my colleague, we run what we were talking about, which is plant dietas. We just finished one in Portugal. We have one coming up July 1st in Ireland. Um, at the time of shooting this right now, we're sold out for the first week, but we have, I think, 2 or 3 spots open for the second week. We don't have our schedule out past that, but probably in the next couple of weeks, we'll have that until the end of the year. I think we're going to be November in the Sacred Valley of Peru for 3 weeks. And also, we've slowly been doing some remote dietas for people who are maybe a bit more open and sensitive. Um, and I think September, we're going to do our first kind of public group remote dieta as well. So we'll have information about both of those out fairly soon. But my website, nicotianarustica.org, you can find that. And then also, as you mentioned, I have a podcast called the Universe Within Podcast, and people can find that on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, all the big platforms.
Yes, I highly recommend checking out Jason's podcast. It's super epic, and I feel like you have the most incredible and well-spoken, wise people on there. So, yeah, I highly recommend.
Hmm. Oh, well, thank you. It was started out as just a lot of friends and colleagues who I knew, and slowly it's kind of bridging out, and people who I really respect and whose work I really respect are coming on. And I that was
Mm.
really the reason I created it, was just to give voice to these people. I think as this work grows, it's really important to have those voices out there.
I agree. Yeah. Yeah, it's been such a beautiful like opportunity for me to kind of share this work more with my family and my friends who don't maybe understand it so much, to share your episodes with them. So I'm super grateful that it
Mm.
exists.
Oh, I'm really happy to hear that. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
That's what I hope we can all do, is bridge all of these worlds. There's a beautiful teacher of mine. His name and title is Amika, and he comes from a group of people in the Colombian Amazon called the Tubu. and they have a prophecy which they say that we're now beginning to fulfill, and it's the time of the Dir Ramasan, which they would translate as the children of the new dawn, and it's the
Mm.
people who can bridge the medicine of the four directions to create a new earth. And I think it's super important because it's acknowledging that all traditions, all directions, all medicines have medicine, and that's part of our our calling now is to really to bridge those to show that we're not really so separate or different, and also this idea of birthing something new from that.
Mm.
So I think it's an interesting time, an exciting time.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Embracing the Mystery, and I hope you enjoyed. To stay connected, you can follow me on Instagram at Danny M. Rem, or follow and like my Facebook business page, Danny Rem Embracing the Mystery, where I share weekly live channelings, guided meditations, and content to help empower you to live an authentic and embodied soul-led life. You can also find the links to this information in the bio of this episode. Thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoyed.